Hi, welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading Supernatural Night Terror by John Passarella. We're up to chapter 25, which is a bit shorter than the last one. The Nognitsa is on the loose. How are they going to stop her? There's been tornadoes, it's all full of chaos, so let's see. What's Sam and Dean going to do? Chapter 25. Kurt Machalek had collected hearts in mason jars because hearts were totems. They imparted mystical powers to the one who claimed them. But for that power to pass to him, he'd had to seize them from living sacrifices. His so-called victims never understood their higher purpose in his apotheosis, so he explained it to them in detail before carving the still beating organs from their chest. To become invulnerable and immortal, he needed to collect 12 hearts. Unfortunately, the FBI caught him after his 7th acquisition and took the hearts from him. Unenlightened, they didn't understand. As a result, when he escaped from his solitary cell, he would have to begin his collection all over again. He'd lost his accumulated mystical power when they captured him and removed his totems. Locked away in his cell in the Supermax wing of Falls Federal, he slept and dreamed of the day when he could restore his mystical energies. Once he got his dozen, he would show them true power. In his dreams, he saw his victims again, every one of them, and he would smile at the fond memories of those early acquisitions. They would scream as the power left their bodies, propelled into their hearts for him to capture. By the time they were still, their power was his to wield, and it electrified him with his growing potential. While he would have preferred to dream and fantasize about future sacrifices to his glorification, he had no control over his subconscious. Not that it mattered. Reliving his so-called crimes was a pleasurable experience, a brief mental vacation. He'd never had nightmares because he feared nobody and nothing. But suddenly his dream became troubling. He'd been toiling over his 4th victim, a young soccer mum who'd begged him to let her go, saying she wouldn't tell if he just let her go, when he noticed people standing around him in a circle. That was wrong. Each sacrifice demanded his complete focus to channel the heart energy at the moment of death. He never allowed witnesses to his sacred rite. But for some reason, while he could sense people closing around him in a tightening circle, he couldn't see them. He plunged the bowie knife into the soccer mum's chest, delighting in the brief scream of primal power as he sliced his way to the pulsing heart and woke up in his bunk in the dim lighting of his solitary cell. But he was not alone. Others stood in his cell in a semicircle around him, their clothes stained with dried blood, smeared and clumped with the dirt of their shallow graves, all except for the young soccer mum standing in the middle of the 7. Her torn blouse was wet with fresh blood, the gaping hole in her chest dripping crimson droplets onto the floor of his cell. "No," he said, "you can't be here, none of you. I took your power." En masse, they stepped forward, their eyes wide with fury, teeth bared, spittle and flecks of blood on their chins. As one, they raised their arms, each holding a butcher knife. "No, this isn't right," he said. "It's personal, sacred." The soccer mum stabbed his thigh, the butcher knife sinking deep enough to scrape bone. He roared in pain and pushed her back. She smiled a wicked little smile and spat in his face. As if that was their cue, the other 6 surged forward, knives rising and falling, plunging into his flesh, slicing his arms and legs, sinking into the meat behind his collarbone, puncturing a lung. Though he was physically strong, they overwhelmed him. Every push and shove, every punch and kick was met with the bite of steel ripping into his flesh. They swarmed over him, knocking him from his bunk. He curled into a fetal position, arms over his face and head, but they remained lowered, cutting through his abdomen and single-minded ferocity. Then, one by one, they reached their grave, cold hands inside his body, and their clawing fingers ripped out his organs and crushed them in their fists. They saved his heart for last. In the break room of Taco Terrace, located at the southern edge of town, Mike Keoghan leaned his chair back against the wall, put his feet on the table, crushed at the ankles, and shoved earbuds into his ears with the iPod's volume turned up loud enough to drown out the usual commotion at the front of the fast food restaurant. He was determined to get maximum value out of his 15-minute break. The previous night he'd been up until nearly dawn, talking on the phone with his girlfriend, who'd had a big fight with her parents about breaking curfew. After a long day he was tired, his feet ached and his eyes burned. He crossed his arms over his chest and closed his eyes, drifting into a nap while Johnny Cash sung about his ring of fire. He dreamed of black smoke rising from a fire, but when he looked for the flames, all he saw was the smoke, hanging overhead like poison clouds. Something was wrong about the black clouds, but the reason escaped him. Slowly, he became aware of someone tugging at his brown polyester Taco Terra shirt. "Couple more minutes," he mumbled. The tugging continued. Irritably, he moved his arm to brush away the person's hand, but something wasn't right. Instead of touching clothes or skin, he felt fur beneath his fingers. Rising to groggy consciousness, he experienced the tugging and pulling from both sides of his body. Something pushed at his chest and arms, even his legs. When he shoved against the weight on his left arm, he yelped, jerking his hand away. Something had bit him. What the hell? Opening his eyes, he saw dozens of beady black eyes staring back at him. Rats, crawling all over his body. They waddled up his torso, pink noses twitching, sharp teeth flashing at him. Yelling, he kicked convulsively, causing the tilted chair to slide down and drop him hard. The back of his head struck the linoleum floor and lights flashed in his skull. In a moment, the rats swarmed over him. Frantically, he looked to the left and right and saw hundreds of them flowing across the floor, a pulsing tide of grimy fur. He rolled onto hands and knees, crushing some rats beneath him, while dozens more bit his hands, neck and ears. He lunged upright and staggered towards the door. They covered his body like a living fur coat, continuing biting his exposed flesh. 3 climbed up the back of his scalp, while another ducked its head inside his mouth, and when he tried to scream, gnawed his tongue. Furious, he bit its head off and spit it out like a bloody wad of chewing tobacco and slammed his body against the door. Several rats were dislodged from his clothing, but others scrambled up his sneakers and under the cuffs of his trousers, clawing his shins and biting the meaty back of his calves. He fumbled with the doorknob, while rats gnawed the back of his hand, tearing away his flesh bit by bit. His own blood made the doorknob slippery, but he finally managed to turn it and push his way through to the cooking area. The customers lined up to order their meals saw him draped with hungry rats before his co-workers noticed. Uniformly, the customers screamed and ran for the exits. One teenage girl held up her cell phone and recorded some video she backed out of the restaurant. But when Mike had opened the door to the break room, all the rats that hadn't climbed on him rushed through the doorway into the restaurant's seating area. The screams became shrieks as the people who hadn't already left shoved each other aside and struggled through the doors. Some fell and were trampled by those behind them, then were attacked by the rats themselves. Mike's co-workers reacted seconds after the customers. Gail had just lifted a metal basket filled with fries out the deep fryer. When she saw him, she screamed and hurled the basket at him. The hot grease dripping from the basket burned his face, but dislodged the 2 rats that had been chewing through his cheeks and another that had crossed over his ear to gnaw on his right eye. "Help me!" Mike cried. Jimmy, who ran on the high school track team, jumped over the counter, his legs swinging to the side and knocking over a condiment stand before landing on all fours in front of the soft drink refill station. Rats covered the floor like a living carpet, and when Jimmy landed on them, they swarmed up his arms and legs. Gail, who was naturally thin, backed away and tried to climb through the drive-through window. Snake-like, she wriggled her way through the narrow gap, but her hips got caught when she bumped the lever that worked the window. Hanging in space, half in and half out of the restaurant, she began to scream in terror. Albert, the night manager, backed away from Mike, a look of incomprehensible horror on his face. He stumbled forward and reached out to catch himself, inadvertently pressing his palms on the hot grill. Yelping in pain, he lurched in the opposite direction. He grabbed the phone off the hook with his tender hands and dialed 911, all the while backing away from Mike and completely ignoring Gail's helpless screams. His heels mushed a jumble of fries strewn on the floor, and he slipped, cracking his forehead against the edge of the counter. By the time the 911 operator asked him to state the nature of his emergency, Albert was unconscious. As she repeated the question a second time, the rats swarming along the floor ignored the plentiful fries and chewed ravenously on Albert's face. Watching Albert accidentally burn his hands had given Mike an idea. He slammed his fur-covered forearms on the grill and burned at least 7 rats, enjoying their pitiful squeals as they sizzled against the hot metal. With his arms free, he stumbled past Albert and kicked running rats away from his feet. He squeezed one eyelid shut to ward off a rat nipping at the tender flesh there, and managed to swat it away before it sank its fangs into his eyeball. Gail was kicking her legs frantically while she screamed, even though the rats hadn't worked their way up to the counter yet, and none were attacking her. Catching her legs in his arms to still them, Mike twisted her hips and pushed her through the window. She fell awkwardly outside with a yelp and a curse, but she had escaped. Since Gail never went anywhere without her cell phone, Mike prayed she would call for help as soon as she stopped freaking out. He tried to call to her, but his voice came out as a gurgle. 2 rats were ripping into his throat, and blood had washed down to the front of his uniform shirt. Too much blood. He felt lightheaded, and his balance was iffy. Seeing the phone dangling from its cord, he staggered towards it and dropped to his knees. He cradled the receiver in his hands, but his fingers were numb, useless. He leaned over and tried to call for help, but no words escaped his lips. Everything had become darker, as if the restaurant lights were dying, and the floor spun beneath him, and then his cheek was pressed to the linoleum, sticky with warm blood. Far away, too far away to matter to him any more, silence wailed in the night. Rat tails slithered along his neck. A cold nose poked into his bloody ear. Darkness swept over him, and he remembered the darkness in his dream of the poisoned clouds. Oh dear. It's a bit grim, wasn't it? Let's hope those poison clouds don't turn up in chapter 26. We'll have to see. See you there.